I'm going to begin today in this brief presentation with the end. It's not that I don't expect to get there, but just to have you keep in mind the end point along the way. So, two of the key findings I'm going to reach by showing you a little bit of evidence today are, number one, that not all households who currently receive any form of housing assistance have all of their housing needs met by that assistance, as we've heard very firmly actually by all of the ministers this morning. Secondly, not all households in housing need are eligible for assistance. And this is where my talk goes to actually today, some of the evidence in new research. The three implications of these two research findings that I'll build up today are, number one, that a targeting and tailoring of housing assistance as we move into the future doesn't actually necessarily have to mean a narrowing and a tightening. What it can mean is a widening and a smartening. Secondly, different types of housing assistance can be tailored to support households with different types of care and work needs, as we've heard in all of the presentations today. We're talking about elderly households, households with disabilities, families with caring responsibilities, and also young adults, young people who are needing a launch pad. Finally, some households do not require deep, entrenched housing assistance of the types that that might spring to mind when we talk about housing assistance in terms of public housing and ongoing rent assistance. Some people may just need a bit of a light touch support or a time-limited support at times of critical life events, such as separation and divorce, migration, settlement, arrival into Australia, health crises, and into old age. So with that in mind, I'm going to present briefly on some new research undertaken with colleagues at Swinburne and funded by AHURI. And in this, instead of beginning from the current setting of housing assistance, what we actually do is begin by a very broad look at first principles. We step back from the current administrative system. We'll come back to that at the end because we need to. But let's step away from it for a moment and think about broadly, who is in housing need in Australia? Let's leave aside for the moment whether they receive it or not. So in our research, we take what we call a tenure-neutral approach. We look at all tenures. In this presentation, I'm not including people who are currently homeless. I would consider homeless people as representing the very, very pointy end of housing system failure. But focusing on people who are housed within regular tenures, let's look at what their needs are. In our research at Swinburne, we use three different types of measures of housing need. We look at what you've already heard about as being the housing affordability, or what we know as housing stress measure, which is the bottom 40% of income, households in that sort of lower income setting, paying 30% or more of their income on housing costs each week. More importantly, I think in our research, what we focus on are this residual income measure. This is basically a measure of how and to what degree can people make ends meet once their housing costs are paid for. And the Social Policy Research Centre at New South Wales has established for Australia some years ago a budget standards around this that we've updated to keep up with living costs that we use here. We use a very low, quite a low sort of poverty line setting, you might say, to look at this, as well as a more modest setting upon which people can participate in Australian society and eat after paying for housing. We also use some subjective hardship measures about the way that people themselves manage their costs and what they go without to meet housing costs if they need to. We identify the types of people who are in housing need and look at the life stage responsibilities and outcomes we might like to see associated with those, such as engaging in work or being able to care for family members. And I'm just going to walk quickly through some of the evidence around this. So to visualise our approach very quickly, what we typically do as housing researchers when we talk about housing assistance is focus on this blue box. These are low-income people in receipt of income support to a considerable degree. This is disability, people in disability support pensions, these are unemployed households, and people with very high other income support payments. What we don't do so well is look at the orange and the grey groups. So the grey group is also a low-income group. In our modelling here, we estimate this group as up to the midpoint in the income distribution because, as you've heard from Gavin already today, we know from existing research that it is not only the very lowest income people who struggle in the housing market today in Australia. We can see housing stress right up into the midpoint into the income distribution. So this group is characterised by people who are transient in work, working poor, you might say, and also older persons who may own their own home but don't have a lot of liquid wealth. The orange group are moderate income people and higher income people with a light amount of family support, that kind of group. So just regular people who may, in some points of their life, need a bit of a housing support system. The assistance. The yellow group are typically people, as you can see, about 70% of the population who really we expect do not need any form of housing assistance at all. So we're widening in our analysis away from just looking focused on the blue group towards the roughly 30% of people that we might think might need some form of housing assistance. So from deep housing assistance for people with complex and higher income support needs to those who might be getting by but for whom one life event or one difficult situation might push them into a situation where they can't manage their housing needs. So based on the middle income measure I'm just reporting on today and the subjective one, on this residual income measure, what we've got in this graph from left to right are Group 1, Group 2, Group 3 and Group 4. We look at the housing tenures within each category, and what these figures basically show are the proportion of households who on that very lowest budget standards measure are deemed to have inadequate income once their housing costs have been met. Inadequate income to meet basic living expenses, food, school excursions, these types of things. So low income groups on income support, we can see not surprisingly actually struggling as we might expect, despite a considerable number of these people already receiving considerable amounts of housing assistance. Importantly, in this group, we can see that home ownership does act as a buffer to reduce the extent of need. What's important, and what I'll skip to quickly, is this third group. These are people who do not have as much connection with the income support system. These are working poor and older people who have housing equity potentially, but not a lot of income and loose money each week. If we take a look at what people say about their ability to get by, we see a much reduced quantum of people actually reporting being in housing need than we see on our objective indicators. And to a large degree, this is likely to be because poverty is normalised. However, having said this, we can also see that across all of these groups, there are some households which are struggling, either when they already are in receipt of housing assistance in various forms, or where they are not deemed to be eligible under typical eligibility criteria that we go into in far more detail in our report. Couldn't pay utilities is an important one, and I think it's a really interesting concept that we've heard about this morning from some of the ministers about how governments can actually work with payments and the way people can manage household finances. I think in tweaking the ways that payments are made, we need to be very, very careful that we still enable households in need to manage their household finances and cash flow, if you like, in ways that still enable people to meet their housing costs. Because what we find in much research is that people will pay housing first because they have to. So another way to think about this is that if we're looking at a range of households that don't necessarily already receive housing assistance, but who come up in our research as being indicated or implicated as being in need at some points in their life. Another thing we've done is look at their household resources. We've considered the question, what sorts of capabilities do households have that they could bring to situations where they have severe financial or other need. We look at bank savings accounts, and we've found that for all of the households who are indicated as being in need, very few have financial savings, as you'd expect. But just focusing on this one graph to make a point this morning, what we do find is that there is considerable housing equity among some households that we would indicate as being in housing need. And the important part of this is to open up an idea in the way that Gavin has introduced an idea around secure leasing. I'd like to present an idea about keeping people in a situation where they can maintain their housing well. So we know that from the basis of quite a lot of work we've done recently, that where homeowners hit a point of housing stress related to life events or lack of ability to pay ongoing housing costs, for example in older age, there's a danger that they will slip into private rental and become not only more burdensome in a long run way for governments, but also pay higher costs actually week by week as they go and slip further into deeper housing assistance need. This graph is based around the idea of the potential of working quite laterally with households who do need some lighter touch types of intervention or need, potentially working with governments in new ways, in new types of partnerships to loosen up some of that housing equity, potentially through things like government guarantees and underwriting of mortgages to keep people in their own housing and to ride these storms, which for some people are often quite short periods of time, but which may maintain their housing over time. So there's a lot of scope, I think, for thinking quite laterally about not only maintaining the very intensive forms of needs that some households need to enable them to navigate the housing costs in Australia at the moment, but also to think about keeping other households out of deep housing need in the future. So to summarise the findings of the report, I've only briefly presented from today, there's a need for housing assistance that extends beyond current housing recipients. There are low and high needs population groups, and currently the lower or lighter needs groups are not groups that are well handled or well engaged with by the housing assistance model that's coupled with income support. To a very large degree, housing needs are life stage dependent, and a targeting and tailoring of housing assistance can better relate to the outcomes we'd like to see for particular life stages. I'm interested in the idea that's canvassed this morning from Queensland that we might better be able to support, for example, young people who have this stark decision around exiting public housing and potentially foregoing opportunities in life. This is a very perverse outcome we don't want to see. So also the idea that some households in need may have resources that they might be able to bring to the table as part of a partnership with government working in new ways. This is part of a widening of housing assistance implementation rather than a narrowing. So the implications of the work that we've recently published in much more detail in the AHURI format are that targeting does not necessarily mean narrowing, it can mean widening and smartening the way we focus and tailor housing assistance for particular household groups. This can include groups that do not currently receive income support, and groups that we know, because of the cost of housing in Australia, are readily able to slip into a housing assistance scenario if we let that happen. Tailoring can support differentiated support needs at key outcomes, for key outcomes at life stages. So we have young people, families with children, people with disabilities and other caring responsibilities, elderly people, and also groups for whom housing and other parts of employment and income support systems are just inherently difficult. Governments can partner in new ways. I think there is scope for optimism. I think the beginning of this session we had the poll from the room. I actually would have put my hand up for a bit of a green space in that donut. I think there is actual room for some lateral innovation around housing assistance and to rethink the way we do housing assistance in quite new ways, not necessarily locked into the systems we currently have in place. And with that, I'll close for the morning. Thank you.